Greetings! Shabbat Shalom. There's an old story about a meat shortage that occurred in the world. There was a problem with an international meat shortage. So a reporter went to the United Nations to get some opinions on the subject. He found some Cubans, and he said, "Excuse me, could you give me your opinion?" I'm sorry. First, he found Americans. The United Nations is located in New York City, so most of the people you're going to find are probably Americans initially. So he found some Americans, and he said, "Excuse me, what is your opinion of the meat shortage?" And they said, "What does shortage mean?" Well, then he went to some Cubans, and he said, "Excuse me, what's your opinion of the meat shortage?" And the Cubans asked him, "What does meat mean?" Then he found some Israelis, and he said to the Israelis, "Excuse me, what is your opinion of the meat shortage?" And they said, "What does excuse me mean?" That's a famous story people like to tell, but it shows how cultures tend to be viewed and may be caricatured, but there's usually a kernel of truth in those sorts of things. Canadians have a reputation of being very polite, and I remember a friend of mine who was Israeli, whose father, who grew up in Canada, or at some point in his life, his family moved to Canada, and Israelis tend to be very aggressive when they get in line. When they tends to be more like pushing and shoving, and that's quite un-Canadian. And his father would say that if he happened to be in a line in Canada and he happened to push against somebody, inevitably the other person would say, "Excuse me," like it was their fault. Canadians are considered people who want to compromise. One of my friends from Northern Ireland one time told me, I think he's now living in the Middle East, but at that time he was in America with me, and he said the story is that when there's a dispute, an American reaches for a weapon, a Canadian reaches for a table. Canadians want to work it out. They want to compromise. The story about why did the Canadian chicken cross the road? To get to the middle. I'm telling you these stories because I wanted to make a point, a larger point. I'm calling this talk Christians in Realville. Christians in Realville. We need to live in Realville, and we need to understand, if we're adults, that we could not choose our parents. We could not choose also where we were born, right? You didn't choose where you were born. And you did not choose where you grew up. And you did not choose when you were born. But these have a tremendous impact on people. Where you were born, where you grew up, when you grew up. This can't help but have an impact on us, and we have to take these factors into account in our spiritual lives. We have to deal with the reality of what particular strengths and weaknesses we might have because of our environment and because of the times in which we live. In Revelation 1 and verse 11, there's a message for the 7 churches. I'm breaking into a thought of Revelation 1:11, saying, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea." Now, I would say that if you studied into those cities, you would find that to some degree, the churches in those cities would reflect the culture of those cities. Each of those churches is evaluated, and strengths and weaknesses are discussed. And I would say that the impact of when this was written, and the church and the churches, the location of those churches would have had an impact. And that is true historically, because I believe, and I know many of you do, that this is in the book of Revelation for a reason, that these 7 churches are giving an overview of a history of God's church historically. And you know that each period in history has its particular zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. The medieval world was different from the Renaissance world, and the Renaissance world is different from the world of the 21st century. You know, a lot of differences occur, particularly, of course, in our age in technology, and that has a big impact on life. You know, nowadays when people are sitting and waiting somewhere, you know, they're on their phones. You know, they're doing all kinds of things with their cell phones, and of course, some decades ago, that wasn't possible. So, if you go through history, you'll find that very likely the strengths and weaknesses of God's church in that particular period reflect Christianity in general, the attitude of Christianity in general at that time. For example, when you come to the 19th century, the late 19th century, we find that Christian commandment keepers are a small group. When I'm talking about Christian commandment keepers, those who are using, you know, the Bible as their source of belief and practices, and who have discovered the Sabbath and the dietary laws and so on. And the Christian commandment-keeping movement is small and not particularly wealthy, but quite zealous and spreading this way of life around the world. Groups are developing in Africa and the Pacific, Philippines and India and in South America, although some of those groups go back to earlier times. But there is quite an expansion on a certain scale, a small scale, but at the same time a very dramatic scale internationally of commandment-keeping Christianity. Well, see, that reflected the spirit of the times. This is the Victorian era, and the time when Britain and America were expanding their influence, and other northwestern democratic and professedly Christian nations were expanding their influence, and there was a great zeal in Christianity to go and to various parts of the world and to do good work, and to at the same time as doing the good work to also preach the gospel as they understood it. So I'm trying to make a point that when we were born and where we were born is going to be a factor in how we relate to God's Word and our spiritual growth. And we do need to take that kind of thing into account. I want to go to 2 Peter, the 2nd chapter. And here we talk about a righteous person, righteous Lot. He's called here righteous Lot. I'm in 2 Peter 2 and verse 6. And, Sodom and Gomorrah, many people are familiar with that account. Even many people who don't know the Bible all that well. They were wicked, they were destroyed. But Lot was living there. Lot was living there with his family. 2 Peter 2:6. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. That's one reason why that account is there, of course, as an example. And delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. He lived there, but he was very upset about what was going on. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. But there he was, living there. Now he chose to go there because that was at that time a fertile region, and his people made the decision to go there and separate from Abraham's people, because Abraham saw that there was a need to separate the two communities, and they chose an area that was fertile, but at the same time it turned out to be morally degenerate area. Let's take a look at righteous Lot, because that's what Peter calls him. in Genesis 19. Now you see how hospitable he was, and you see that he went out of his way to be hospitable. And the Bible talks about entertaining angels unawares. He didn't know they were angels when he offered them help. Genesis 19. But you know the situation there. You know what the men of Sodom wanted to do, and look at how Lot handled it in Genesis 19:7, and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish, only to do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof." Now this is how he chose to handle the situation. And, you might, from your vantage point, question this. But this was righteous Lot, and yet this was how he chose to handle the situation. So I would say one way to evaluate this is to keep in mind, when he was living and where he was living. But, it is certainly a challenging passage. And if you keep reading, you see what his daughters did. They were stuck in an area where there were no men, and maybe they had the feeling that there were no men anywhere, but in any case where they were, there were no men. In verse 30 of that same chapter, then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him. Now remember, his wife, she had looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. So that's something interesting too. She seemed to long for the environment that they were being delivered from. And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father." Noble intention, but, again, from our vantage point, this is a challenging passage. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Now another question would arise as to why Lot was able to drank that heavily. One would think that he would need to have drunk heavily for this to happen. It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, "Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father." So for some reason they felt like both of them needed to do that. Then they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. I guess the idea was each of them wanted offspring. Each of them wanted to have that part in preserving the family. Or maybe they felt like, there was a better chance of one of them getting pregnant if they both did it. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The way it worked out, indeed, they both conceived. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, and, he became a nation. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. Moab would be roughly from father. And Ben-Ami, he is the son of my people. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So again, this passage raises challenges. But again, remember that these daughters had grown up in Sodom. So that was the environment that they knew. That was the culture that they knew. That period of history and that particular place. And so that is going to influence their perspective. As I said, their motives were righteous motives, but you see the approach taken. As I said, we reading it now have our questions about the approach that was taken. Now we understand the account of Adam and Eve and the ideal of marriage, and we find in Matthew 19 Jesus Christ going back to that when asked about marriage, when asked about divorce in Matthew 19. And he answered, this is the 4th verse, and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man ought to leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So obviously the biblical ideal is one man, one woman for life. That is clear from the scriptures. But that was not what was happening at the time of Abraham and Sarah. That was not the culture of the ancient Middle East. Let's go to Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, this is the first verse of Genesis 16, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So evidently this maidservant was specifically the property of Sarai, before her name was changed to Sarah. So Sarai said to Abram, before his name was changed to Abraham, "See now, the Eternal has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. Now, she volunteered that solution. That was what she wanted. So, within the culture of that period, this was a reasonable request that Sarah felt she should do. A child of your servant would have, in effect, be, in a certain legal sense, your child. And that was the way she wanted to give a child to Abraham from her. It would come from her handmaid. This was the legal process of the day. You see it again in the case of Rachel and Leah, if you keep reading. That comes up again later. That's why we have, 4 of the tribes. We have Dan and Naphtali, and I think it's Gad and Asher, right? That come from the, let me just go to that. Genesis 29, or actually I'll go to Genesis 35. That gives the genealogy of the tribes. And it's interesting that the 12 tribes of Israel, the very basis of the Old Covenant Church, come from 4 women who were alive at the time. In other words, Jacob had children by 4 wives who were all alive at the time, 2 wives and 2 concubines. In verse 23, the sons of Leah were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and then we have Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin, and then her handmaid gave him Dan and Naphtali, and as I said, Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, gave him Gad and Asher. So we had 4 different women who were alive at the time, living together, and Jacob had children by all of them, and they represent the matriarchs in a sense of the Old Covenant Church. So now I go back to the story of Abraham and Hagar, and in the 4th verse, well, let's go to the 3rd verse. Then Sarai, this is Genesis 16:3, Abram's wife took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when but unfortunately it led to strife. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. So, we see here, it turned out to create problems, and in some ways those problems, persist right on into the contemporary times in some ways. So, again, what Sarah did would have seemed maybe a normal in her time, but it obviously is not the principle that Jesus Christ explained in Matthew 19 based on Genesis 1. And from our perspective, looking back on it, it's a challenging passage, as also what I read a moment ago about the what happened with Jacob. Now, we have the example of Gideon, a great hero of the Bible, one of the judges, and his story is generally known, maybe not as well known as it might have been in earlier days when the Bible was better known in America, where I'm speaking from. But let me go to the book of Judges, and I'm going to go to the... I want to go to the 9th chapter. Talks about let's go to, back to the 8th chapter and verse 30. Okay, Judges 8:30. Gideon had 70 sons. How did that happen? Who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. Now Gideon was a judge, and God performed miracles through him. But he must have had, I would say, a good number of wives to have 70 sons. Besides that, he had a concubine in the next verse we read. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, or Shechem in Americanese, also bore him a son whose name he called Abimelech, and we see Abimelech as the first Israelite king later on in the 9th chapter. So again, it's a challenging passage, but it does reflect the culture of that time and place. I want to go to Hebrews, the 11th chapter. This is the Faith Hall of Fame, Hebrews 11. These are heroes of the Bible. And many of them are still well known, even in modern times. And movies are made, and songs are sung, and so forth. And in verse 32 of Hebrews 11, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon." And I just mentioned Gideon and that aspect of his life that not everybody knows about. And I'm not trying to do it in a snide way. I'm just trying to point out, that people acted in such a way that perhaps you could say fell short of the ideal standard, but it did reflect the standards of their time and place. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson. Now you read about Samson, you have your ups and downs regarding Samson, but he's here. He's a hero. He's a hero of faith. And Jephthah, again, you could argue what he did with his daughter, but whatever it was certainly, to say the least, an extreme action, not required biblically, not required by the God of the Bible. Also of David and Samuel and the prophets. And, of course, David did repent of the difficulty that he had. He did repent of it. So the point that is brought out is that Samuel and the prophets are mentioned together with these others who lived at the time of the judges, when the times were such. What the times of the judges were like, and it's mentioned several times in the book. I hadn't planned to turn there, but I'll go back to Judges just to reflect, that the book itself talks about the way things were at the time of the judges. Well, I'll just read the last verse. There are 3 verses that bring this out. I'll read the last one, as the whole book is summarized here. Verse 25 of Judges 21. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And so there was a kind of breakdown of authority, and people had their ideas about what was right and wrong, and acted accordingly. And you can read about it in the book of Judges. And even very, very virtuous people had maybe you could say severe failings at that time. Their perspective was warped, again, by I would say to some degree by time and place. I'd like to go to 2 Timothy. Paul wrote a second letter to Timothy as he was about to face martyrdom, and he projected forward into the end times. And around the time as the Holocaust was developing, I think actually perhaps in the midst of it, a great rabbi in Europe who was martyred in the Holocaust, Elchanan Wasserman. He wrote a book called on the Steps of the Messiah, or on the Heels of the Messiah. That is to say, he believed that indeed the time of the Holocaust was a precursor to the Messianic period. And I believe that's true, but it didn't happen obviously as fast as he might have thought it would happen, or as fast as some of us thought it would happen. But I think we are certainly a lot closer to Messianic times, and I think that what happened in World War II was to some degree a precursor of the coming tribulation before the second coming of Christ. But at that time, he quoted from the Talmud, which you can read in the tractate Sanhedrin, I think around what we call those folio 97, about how culture would deteriorate in the end time. And this is also what 2 Timothy has to say. Paul, as you know, studied under Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel. And so what he writes in 2 Timothy 3 is also what you find in Orthodox Jewish tradition. And in 2 Timothy 3, Paul writes, but know this, that in the last times, perilous times will come. So as we get closer and closer to the end, evidently there'll be a moral deterioration in the world. And let's understand, in 2020, where I'm speaking, there are a tremendous number of good people in the world, people sacrificing, people, going above and beyond. It's all around us, and we certainly respect and honor those who do. And also, we have to realize, too, that many people who maybe have very warped ideas and practices in some ways have very good ideas and practices in other ways. It's a mixture. So, I'm not sort of giving a general condemnation of our civilization. I'm just saying that our civilization is quite flawed and overall probably getting worse. I can say personally, I've lived long enough to have seen in my own nation a declining moral climate. I would just have to say that from my own experience. And even within my own community, I left the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community when I was 22 and was baptized. I think that's how old I was at the time, 1968, right? So I was baptized. But I still try to follow events and what's going on in the community. And even in that community, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, one finds scandals that I was already an adult when I left. I was 22, so I wasn't totally sheltered from you might say, the seamier side of that community. But I never heard of such things as I'm reading about now going on in that community. So even in that one little corner of the world that I'm familiar with, it's not what it was. Unfortunately. And Paul says that, that's going to be the trend. As we get closer to the end, that's going to be the trend. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men shall be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy. One thing that when I was a young man in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, one thing that was noticeable to that community living in America was the disrespect of parents. That was somehow, to them, kind of typical of American culture, was disrespect for parents. It's kind of interesting. This was back in the 60s. Unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. So perhaps attending some kind of services, participating in certain rituals, but, as far as the actual moral core, lacking, right? Having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. Obviously, this is not the kind of people that we need to be. I'm trying to look for the term that used to be translated. Okay, here they call them unloving. Well, in many ways we see that. Now, fortunately, there's, as I said, a lot of good people, a lot better than I am out there. But I'm saying the trend, unfortunately, is a negative one overall. I hate to have to say that. And also, the writings of Paul indicate that the worst, unfortunately, is yet to come in that regard. That as we get closer to the return of Christ, it will get even worse. And what he says at the conclusion of the passage is, "From such turn away." Well, obviously, it's going to become harder and harder to turn away if that becomes the more and more dominant way of life. If the culture deteriorates morally, then we're going to come to the point where perhaps we tolerate more of it than we should and compromise with it more than what we should. So each of us is living in an area that has its strengths and weaknesses, and each of us lives in an area where people tell jokes about the area, about what it's like to come from that area, what Californians are like, what Texans are like, or, and so on, and maybe what Italians are like. And some of those are maybe cutting, and maybe some of those are inappropriate. But regarding some of these anecdotal comments that are made, they reflect a certain seed of truth in terms of the fact that cultures have a certain way that they operate, and people who come out of those cultures have a certain way in which they tend to behave. And as I said, we can build on the strengths. We can build. I mean, some cultures, for example, my culture was very strong in education. Jews are strong on education. Well, that's a good thing, and Middle Eastern people are strong on hospitality. That's a good thing, and on I could go. So cultures have their strengths, but cultures also have their weaknesses. So what we need to do is kind of evaluate, where what are the influences that are working on us? What are the positive ones? What are the negative ones? And then how are we going to overcome the negative ones? How are we going to build on the positive ones? And so I'm going to conclude by going to Revelation 3. This is a classic statement about what I'm talking about. We can't help, where we were born. We can't help when we were born, where we grew up, when we grew up. That's happened. That's part of our development. That's part, very much a part of who we are. But now, whoever we are, we've repented of the negative side of it. We've been baptized. The blood of Jesus Christ has covered our sins. Hands have been laid on us. We have received God's Spirit, and God's Spirit is helping us to understand His will and giving us the discipline to live His way of life. And so now we can utilize that power to overcome and to grow, and in effect to battle whatever negative environmental influences are there, past, present, and then future. And as it says in Revelation 3:21, to him who overcomes, Revelation 3:21, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. So it's a wonderful future ahead of us if we are overcomers. And so we have to understand the reality of the world in which we live and deal with it. And we can deal with it positively with God's help. We can be Christians in Realville. All the best to you and yours.